Hey, what is up guys? MerganMan4 here, and today I'm going to be continuing my series of classic Doctor Who reviews with the 7th and final season of Tom Baker's Mighty Incarnation, Season 18. And while this season may have marked the end of one era, it also marked the start of a brand new one, and brought about some of the biggest changes since the beginning of the show. Starting in Season 18 is John Nathan Turner in the role of producer, a role that he would hold for the remainder of the classic era. And with him, he brought about some of the biggest changes that the show had ever seen. Season 18 featured a brand new title sequence, a new variation of the theme, which was actually the first one to stray away from the original Derbyshire rendition, aside from the abandoned Delaware theme in the early 70s, along with a new outfit for the Doctor, a stronger focus on the scientific, as well as a gradual phasing out of the old and in with the new in terms of the Doctor and his companions. Season 18 marks a bold new start to an era, and one that I would largely label a success. The Leisure Hive kicks off this new era by throwing us right into the deep end, with no sense of transition from previous producer Graham Williams to the new producer John Nathan Turner. We know right from the off that this isn't the same Doctor Who that we've had for the last little while, and I for one love it. Aside from bringing Doctor Who into the next decade, The Leisure Hive is also just a really fun story on its own merits. It's got a fascinating concept that revolves around time manipulation and cloning. It's got memorable guest characters as well as some fantastic cliffhangers and a very well realized setting as well. I should also note that I love the music in this story. In fact, the music throughout this entire season is great, and Tom has some wonderful moments as well, both when he's his regular age and when he's really advanced in age later on in the story. That's not to say that the story is without its flaws. Okay, we get it, we're on a beach. But on the whole, The Leisure Hive is an immensely entertaining story and a great new start to this new era. So it's going to be a definite 8 out of 10 for me. Meglos is a story that gets a lot of flack from fans. And, I mean, it's true that it can get pretty silly in points. I mean, a talking cactus, really? But honestly, it's really not all that bad. It can be pretty fun if you just let yourself go and enjoy it. The gas tags in particular are very entertaining, with Bill Fraser turning in a really memorable and entertaining performance as Grugger, and Tom Baker does a superb job playing both the Doctor and Meglos throughout the story. And while it wasn't as fleshed out as it probably could or should have been, the Tigelan Society is still a pretty fascinating concept, split through the middle between science and religion. All in all, you're not going to miss very much if you skip Meglos, but it is a pretty fun time, so for me, I'm going to be giving it a solid 7 out of 10. Full Circle is the beginning of a trilogy that's generally referred to as the E-Space trilogy. Essentially, the TARDIS accidentally travels into a pocket universe, leaving the Dr. Romana and K9 trapped there. We begin the trilogy on the planet Alzarius, and it's here that we're introduced to our first of the new companions, Adric. Now, Adric gets a lot of hate among the fandom. It would not be unfair to say that he's the most hated companion within fandom, and to be honest, for the most part, I can definitely see why. But, Full Circle actually does a pretty good job introducing him and setting him up, and at least for now, his existence is pretty well justified. He's not bad in this story. The story also builds up a pretty great threat in the Marshmen, with the tense atmosphere of Mistfall providing the perfect setting for their sudden appearance. Full Circle also boasts some really neat twists as well, specifically that everyone from the Starliner, who believed that they crash-landed on Alzarius centuries ago from the planet Pterodon, are actually natives of Alzarius and evolved from the Marshmen. And I have to admit, given that the writer of this story, Andrew Smith, was only 18 at the time of writing it, It's pretty impressive. That being said, while I certainly like it, I don't think there's anything about the story that I love about it, so I can't give it too high of a score, so I think I'm going to stick it around 7.5 out of 10. Our second entry into the E-Space trilogy, State of Decay, has a very simple premise. Vampires in space. This is the kind of gothic horror sci-fi mixture that appeared so often in the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era of the show, so it stands out pretty easily here. And I think it's great. I've always been a fan of this story ever since the first time I watched it, and I find that the juxtaposition of vampires with science fiction is one that works really well, especially when the story boasts such great set design, chilling moments, and has some fantastic performances, particularly thinking of Emrys James as Okkon. It's a really easy one to enjoy. My only wish is that the King Vampire had been executed better, because quite frankly it does not look good or convincing. But even with that, I'd say that State of Decay is a really enjoyable story and worthy of at least an 8 out of 10. Warrior's Gate is one of those stories that really needs multiple rewatches to properly appreciate and understand it. It's not one that you can really watch first time and feel completely satisfied with. For me, this is something that took until last year, about a year or so before the Season 18 Blu-ray came out, before it finally clicked with me. And it's fantastic. For starters, the story is visually arresting. We begin with this great montage with the camera trawling through the ship's corridors. We have the endless white void, segments in black and white with just the actors in color. Rorvik makes for a great villain, especially when he legitimately starts to go crazy near the end of the story. And the time-sensitive Therals are a fascinating race, not least because there are shades of grey. We begin seeing them as victims, but as time goes on we learn more about them and realize that they themselves are not innocents. It's also got one of the darkest and most disturbing moments in the show's history, one that I'm genuinely surprised was allowed through. When we see a Theral getting tortured, it's haunting howls echoing all around and smoke just pouring off of its body. Probably the only real downers throughout the story is Adric, who honestly gets like nothing to do. As if he's not on screen, you forget he even exists. And Romana's exit, which has to contend for one of the worst companion exits in the show's history, especially seeing as it comes out of absolutely nowhere, and when it happens, they're given all of 2 seconds to say goodbye. The Doctor doesn't even seem sad. Oh well, what can you do? It was a very troubled production, but on the whole, I think it really paid off, and Warrior's Gate easily gets an 8.5 out of 10 for me. Here we kick off the beginning of a trilogy which trails into Season 19. I've already covered the last part of this trilogy in my Season 19 review, and now I can finally talk about the first 2 parts of it. As I mentioned in that review, I'm not the biggest fan of this trilogy. There are absolutely moments and ideas that I love, but I don't think any of the stories themselves are anything particularly special. While I wouldn't say that The Keeper of Traken is my least favorite of the trilogy, that would go to Castrovalva, I would say that Traken is the least memorable of the 3. Like Castrovalva in Castrovalva, Traken is just not an interesting place, which means that it's difficult to get invested in what's going on there. The story is a fine introduction to Nyssa, who won't become a companion until the next story, but on the whole, she is pretty forgettable throughout it. I would say that the best things in this story are Anthony Ainley as Tremas and Jeffrey Beavers as the Master, who's sadly relegated to basically just a couple of minutes in the last episode, aside from a couple of lines throughout the earlier episodes. I know that we get 2 more stories of the Master right after this one, but for a return to the character after over 3 seasons, I can't help but feel underwhelmed. And besides, as great as Ainley is in the role, it does mean that this is all we have of the Beavers Master, which is a real shame. In any case, it's not that The Keeper of Traken is bad, it's just underwhelming and forgettable. I don't want to be too harsh on it because there are some really good things in it, some good ideas and moments, but at the same time, there is a decent amount that I'm not a huge fan of in it, so I can't really justify giving it any higher than a 6 out of 10. It's the end, but the moment has been prepared for. The juggernaut that is Tom Baker is gone. This is his final stand. Perhaps coincidentally, I feel very similarly about Logopolis as I did Tom Baker's first story, Robot. It's fun, it's enjoyable, but for what should be a very momentous occasion, it doesn't feel special, or even particularly memorable. There are certainly aspects that I love about it. The Watcher, for example, is a great concept, and works very well as a way of setting up and foreshadowing what's to come. There's also some great moments of mystery and suspense as well, such as when the Watcher and the Doctor talk on the bridge, as we take Adric's perspective, having no idea what they're saying to each other. The stakes are also suitably high, with a large percentage of the universe literally disappearing thanks to the entropy unleashed by the Master. And Anthony Ainley, too, is great in his first story in the role, after playing Tremas last time, even if it does take him a while to get introduced. There's also some fantastic and memorable visuals throughout, such as when the TARDIS lands on the barge or the Doctor is disoriented inside the shrunken TARDIS. However, I'm not sure why, but other than these things, Logopolis fails to leave much of an impression on me, and I find myself forgetting about it much more frequently than any other Regeneration story. Again, that's not to say that it's bad. There is some really good stuff in here, but unfortunately, the mighty Tom Baker's final story fails to leave as much of an impression as it should. So I'll only be giving it a basic, if still respectable, 7 out of 10. Season 18 is one of a very rare bunch for me in that every single story of the season I find relatively close in quality. There's only a few points difference between the lowest and the highest. That doesn't happen too often for me. It's certainly one of the most consistent seasons of the show, and there's only 1 or 2 stories in it that I wouldn't feel like popping on if I was bored, although even those ones are still entertaining enough in their own right. Perhaps my favorite thing about this season is the radical shift in tone from what came before. Not because I particularly disliked Graham Williams' version of the show, more that I love the show going full force into the 80s. The music is fantastic in every single story, and there are numerous stories throughout the season that have a very distinctive, memorable visual feel to them. There's also a stronger focus on the scientific, something that I'll admit they did go a little bit overboard with at times, but for the most part I generally enjoyed. And it's also neat to see the show experimenting with some mini-arcs, first with E-Space, which I should mention is a fantastic concept, and would be really neat to see spanning an entire series rather than just a couple of stories. And then with the first 2 parts of the Master Trilogy, which is a much more personal arc compared to E-Space's plot arc. Overall, Season 18 is a very enjoyable season, and generally a pretty strong one for Tom Baker to end his 7-year run on. And now, without further ado, it's time to compare Season 18's stories both to each other and to the other seasons that I've reviewed. So how does the fresh and new Season 18 compare? Well, the first order of business is to rank the episodes, which, as I previously mentioned, are all surprisingly close to each other. The top dog is Warrior's Gate with an 8.5 out of 10, followed by State of Decay and the Leisure Hive, both with 8 out of 10, Full Circle with 7.5 out of 10, Logopolis and Meglos with 7 out of 10, and finally the Keeper of Traken with 6 out of 10. This gives Season 18 an average of 7.4 out of 10. So then, how does this stack up to Tom Baker's first season, as well as John Nathan Turner's second? When comparing the seasons, Season 18 takes the top spot, just barely edging out Season 12. As for decades, it gives the 80s a bit of a boost, bringing them up to 6.8 out of 10, while Tom Baker's era is ever so slightly brought up to a 7.3 out of 10, keeping him well above Davison. Meanwhile, Steve Gallagher slots into 5th for writers with an 8.5 out of 10, David Fisher takes 6th with an 8 out of 10, Terrence Dix is now in 7th with a 7.8 out of 10, Andrew Smith follows in 8th with a 7.5 out of 10, John Flanagan and Andrew McCulloch are close behind in 9th with a 7 out of 10, Christopher H. Bidmead is down to 11th, while his average goes up to 6.3 out of 10, and finally Johnny Byrne sits in 12th with a 6 out of 10. Next up is producers, and while Season 18 doesn't add any new producers to our list, it does alter the scores of both Barry Letts and John Nathan Turner, with the former now receiving an average of 7.4 out of 10, while the latter has an average of 6.8 out of 10. Following producers is script editors, with Christopher H. Bidmead entering to take the top spot with an average of 7.4 out of 10. And as for directors, Paul Joyce joins in at 2nd with an 8.5 out of 10, while Peter Grimwade is brought down to 3rd with a still very respectable 8.4 out of 10. Lovett Bickford in 4th with an 8 out of 10, Peter Moffat down to 6th with a 7.8 out of 10, while Terence Dudley takes 8th with a 7 out of 10, and John Black reaches 10th with a new average of 5 out of 10. At last we have our event episodes, and kind of a flip from last time with Season 19, Season 18 actually receives the top spot in every category. In the premiere category, the Leisure Hive takes the top with an 8 out of 10, bringing this category's average to 7 out of 10. Meanwhile, Logopolis tops the finales with our first good one, bringing its average up to a still lowly 4 out of 10. And finally, Logopolis begins the regeneration category at a 7 out of 10. And that's Season 18 of Doctor Who. A bold new beginning for a new era, as well as a bittersweet ending. And one that I think generally succeeds on both counts. But please put your thoughts and opinions on Season 18 down in the comments below. And with that, Merganman4, over and out, and I'll see you guys later.